Good evening. Tonight we are interviewing Bronwyn Williams, who is a futurologist and an economics expert. Anything you'd like to add to that, Bronwyn, for your introduction?
Yeah, well, officially I'm a partner at Fluxtrends, and so basically I get to read books and then tell people about them for a living, which is fantastic. I highly recommend it, but good luck trying to do that unless you have been doing an awful lot of reading for an awful long time, because that's what essentially we paid to do, is to have a very broad and quite a deep general knowledge. So we have the luxury of dabbling and following our curiosity down many different paths with the view to hopefully connecting some dots in unexpected and interesting ways for our clients.
No, that's excellent. I actually had a poke around that big, long list of yours. It's quite varied, but I thought one book stuck out really enormously because I studied philosophy at undergrad, and I remember reading Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and I thought that one really sticks out like a sore thumb, because unlike every other book that's sort of made for a normal person to be able to read, there's this horrible, obnoxious, very, very dry philosophy book, which you recommended very, very hard. But I've read it, and I know that it is not light reading by any by anybody's
sometimes
standards.
you got to stretch yourself.
Yes,
mix it up, right? Everything from children's books all the way through to Gödel-ish books. So there you go. I think
that was a fun book. Yeah,
I have at least extended my range quite broadly. You can't criticize me for pigeonholing my reading tastes.
Oh no, of course that would not be possible after looking at that list. But
clearly, no book club will have me after looking at that.
I can't imagine the wine moms of Constantia plowing through Critique of Pure Reason. There's no way.
No. So I found the best way to develop reading peers is to have a wine club that strictly drinks wine.
Yeah, keep the wine and the book separate.
Yeah. And then connect with friends and strangers on the internet, which seems to be working out quite well.
No, excellent. I actually have what I'd actually think is very interesting, because a lot of that book might be very chunky for most people, but for me the big takeaway from it. Oh my God! I mean, look, the edition I've got is from is the Michael John translation from, what's it, like 1870? Was it 1847? So a young Jewish fellow from London who translated it when he was, I think he started when he was 17. He started the translation, and it's still the standard translation now, because apparently Kant's writing in German was so awful that even the German scholars like to read the English translation. So, but there is an idea that comes from his works, even though he's been wrong about a lot of little details of human cognition and so on. The one idea that I thought really, really stuck out was that our knowledge is limited by the very structure of our brains, and the universe doesn't really necessarily conform to the way that we see it. We've got like this big biological filter.
Yeah.
And do you think that that's is that the big has that been very influential on how you've organized your knowledge in other areas?
Not necessarily. I think all these ideas are interesting to play with, and I think that Kant's obviously one of those ideologues that you have to grapple with in order to be part of the conversation that's going on across the world. Okay. But I also like his rather definitive morality. I think that simple morality tends to be the best sort of morality. Otherwise, you've got to go all the way back to Aristotle and ethics, right? I mean, there's not a lot of good thinking on what's actually ethical. And for me, I think what I strive to be personally from my own ethics is just to be consistent. And I think that's why thinkers like that speak to me, because I think that's what ethics really does come down to avoiding hypocrisy. So I try to live by that motto, and I do tend to be attracted to thinkers who tend to think along those lines. Although it does get a bit tricky when you get into sort of painting yourself into binary corners. It's not to be dogmatic about it, but rather to apply that as the first sort of principle. I think that's a worthwhile starting point, because we try to make it all just too complicated. I mean, there's nothing worse than having a conversation with someone who's trying to base their morality on virtue ethics, for example, because that's impossible.
Ooh,
you get into gray areas straight away.
You and me would have a very, very long argument about that one. But that one's for another time.
Say that for another time. Let's not bore your audience too much.
No, but there's speaking of ethics, there's been a big topic in the news the past week or two about, still ongoing, about speculation in the stock market. And to some extent, there's a lot of populist feeling that, okay, if the game's rigged, then what's wrong with rigging it from the bottom? And I'm not sure exactly what your position on this is from an ethical standpoint, and I think that might be a good point to tackle it from before we get into. Although we might actually, it's probably best to begin with the technical issues, because what exactly is going on there is not known to everybody.
For people that don't know, haven't been following the news, it's probably important to look at that.
Yes.
Do you want to frame the issue for?
Yes, for an ordinary person. People know that you can kind of buy stocks and they move based on the demand for the stocks and whether people think that the company is valuable. But what we've seen recently is social media getting together in a large crowd on Reddit and chasing the prices up of these seemingly arbitrary companies, almost entirely because they're of their joke value. And somehow this is going to destabilize the major hedge funds of the world. How does that work?
Well, first of all, I think the thing to realize is this is not exactly a new idea. People have been gaming the stock market since it was invented. In fact, that's why we have a stock market. So I think the first thing to think about is that ethics has got nothing to do with any of this. And there are no heroes in this game. There's only amoral interests at play. So I think if we can put that on the table, it frames the conversation in quite a different way. It's not like Robin Hood himself wasn't entirely altruistic. I mean, he had something in it to gain, even if you want to go back to knotting wood and all the rest of it.
It's funny you say that. Nobody reads the original Robin Hood poems. Because in the original poems, he didn't even give to the poor. He just stole and made a fool out of the authorities.
Yeah, so he had fun out of it. So he's the perfect character to put into this. But it's not about morality. It's about what you can get away with. But that's what the market has been developed to do. And unfortunately for us, this is where the problem comes in. We've made it too complicated. The more complicated we make our systems, the more loopholes they are, because when you try and manage complexity, it bunches up in very different places and has very unexpected effects. And what's happened is that laymen, or people that aren't insiders, outsiders, have found a way to play the same game and to exploit the same loopholes that insiders have been exploiting for a very long time. So depending on who you sort of identify with in this sort of crisis, you can try and pick out a hero, but I think it would be very disingenuous to say that anyone is acting out of altruism in these instances. And it's an interesting case study as to what's happened with this whole, the Robin Hood as in one name now that we're talking about, the stock traders that have basically piled onto meme stocks, as they're calling them, via Reddit chat forums, where they basically got outsider collusion instead of insider collusion going on.
Yes.
And as you say, it was a coordinated attack to exploit a particular vulnerability in the marketplace, in this case, to basically short squeeze big hedge funds that had large positions on very particular stocks, and to coordinatedly sort of destroy that well-placed trade, which was already a disingenuous trade based on sort of scooping up some profits on someone else's loss. But all we see is really a sort of a pass the parcel in terms of evil, if you want to put it that way, but also playing a high risk game in that you're passing that risk forward, because even now we've seen that those stocks, those meme stocks that have been pumped by these colluding outsiders, have started to, of course, decline in price, because those were prices that were propped up based on market coordination rather than intrinsic value of the underlying share. Which means, of course, the earliest colluders, just like the earliest looters to get into a shop after an earthquake, get the nice gains, whereas the people that sort of ran into to do the looting a bit later tend to be the ones that get rounded up by the police, which is what we're kind of seeing now. As the prices go down, the later people that tried to pile onto this, all motivated by their own greed, let's be honest over here. Yeah. They're the ones that end up carrying the can. And in fact, the metaphor that really stuck out for me over there is Douglas Adams, the famous science fiction writer.
Yes.
Dirk Gently and the his detective agency. And the second book in that series is, of course, The Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul. And in that, there is basically the whole plot hinges around essentially a hot potato game where the last person in the greed chain gets to pay the price for everyone else's collusion. And that's what we have to understand. When we play in these games, you take on the risk, you're prepared to take on the risk, you can gain from someone else's pain. In every trade in the marketplace, there's a winner and a loser. So there's no altruistic profit taking in the marketplace. But at the end of the day, someone is left holding the hot potato and someone has to pay the piper. Who that is, of course, changes all the time. And what normally happens is the little guy, the outsider, that ends up paying the cost for the risk that was taken on by people higher up the food chain. This time, it seems like the risk has been able to be passed, at least partially back up the food chain, but I'm a bit cynical as to how that will even end up playing out, given the sort of the pockets in play there and the sort of bailouts in play, as to whether the wealthier and the wealthy barons in this environment actually get punished or not. I'm not sure that's actually going to happen. But what is for sure is that some people ended up passing the pain a bit further down to the next sucker in line. But this is the markets. Play with fire, you can get burnt.
There's an interesting angle to this, and I won't call it exactly ethical. However, there certainly is an ideological angle that's been accompanying a lot of this. And I've heard it referred to as anarcho-populism. So the very idea that, we don't like these guys, we're just going to smash them. And a lot of this is targeting the most maximally disruptive, sort of parts of the market. And recently the attention has shifted to the silver market. So now, what makes silver so much more dangerous than simply GameStop or AMC or any of those
well, to start with, a single stock is a single stock. So it's a particular entity. And in fact, most of these companies that have had short sales placed on them have some problems with their fundamentals. So, they already are sort of a fragile, destabilized corner of the marketplace, but they're essentially still ring-fenced, or they would be, unless your very big funds start to place very big leveraged trades on them, like shorts and longs and puts and stops and all the rest of it, which is where it gets interesting, which is why the new Biden presidency already started an investigation into pumping of penny stocks, which is quite something to think that the president of the United States is getting involved with the share price of penny stocks. But anyway, we'll put that on the side for a second. But when you come down to commodities, things like silver and gold and oil futures and all the rest of it, they're much more systemic. It's not contained to a particular domestic market or to a particular stock exchange. These are commodities that are traded globally, so they have much more trades placed on them. So of course, with a particular stock like a Gamestop, only a certain handful of hedge funds would have short positions on those stocks because there's so many stocks in the marketplace. And Gamestop, let's face it, is not actually on the radar of most of your fund managers across the world. But a couple of hedge funds would have spotted an opportunity, placed a bet, and that's what's happened here. So you've got really these sort of Reddit forums that have decided to target and take out these particular vulnerable gazelles limping at the end of the herd, and take them out en masse. And they're able to do that quite successfully because of the way it's leveraged there, the way they are only a couple of people that end up getting crucified if they go after that. Silver, gold, other commodities, different story because there's so many trades placed on them from so many different angles and from so many different places across the world. When you start messing with those markets, you start messing with big money, but not just big money, you start messing with dynamic systems. Because it's not just a case that one company has a particular position that you're targeting, essentially. So you're going after that particular kill. You're going after a dynamic system that you might not fully understand. And that can have systemic issues. But at the same time, the power of a sort of anarchist little like Reddit group is not going to be as significant in pumping a global market like something like silver than it is with a highly illiquid, basically penny stock on the other side. So there's a lot of influence in play there. But what is interesting to me is that it always seems to be silver is often a symbol of your anarchists that want to go after the system. The history of silver is absolutely fascinating, and how particularly in America, it's always been the sort of symbol of the alternative currency to the gold that was controlled by the elites. So it's an interesting one to see them going after that, because what we're really seeing here, and let's be perfectly honest, is we're seeing an interclass war between the mass affluent or the upper middle class and the really wealthy. So this is really a battle between the 10% and the 1%. It's not the real poor that are taking on the really wealthy. And I think that's an interesting dynamic, an interesting metaphor for society at large, because that's where a lot of the problems and the fractures and all the drama we see across the world is really this interclass battle between the current elite and the future elite, essentially jostling for position.
Are you making a prediction here?
Well, yes, and to a certain degree, but then we're going to go way down my sort of weird futuristic rabbit hole rather quickly. I don't know if you want to jump right into that. Then. So I should take a breather.
No, let's do that. Let's do that right now.
Let's do that, because I think it is a good segue into my sort of general thesis as to where we are right now. The problem is we have democracy in name, but not really in nature. We get to pick a party, not even to pick a person. We've got capitalism in name, but not in nature. We don't have free markets, please. I mean, people are saying this proves free markets suck. No, it doesn't. It proves we don't have free markets to start with. I mean, let's be honest here. So we've got these problems here, but we've also got developing probably the biggest crisis of the Weird West. I'm sure you've heard that term, the Weird West. The sort of
no, I actually haven't.
Weird, yeah, Western.
Weird is in the acronym.
Educated.
Okay.
Yeah, rich and developed worlds. Yes, the Weird West. The Weird West is facing a social contract collapse, and it's coming from many different directions. And of course, COVID has only accelerated this. Because let's face it, every nation state is based on a contract, and the contract is we pay taxes, and in exchange we get protection. This is basically what the contract boils down to at its absolute base.
Yeah, the Thomas Hobbes vibe
there. Yeah, we pay taxes for law and order. We pay taxes to keep the poor and the desperate away from our doors. This is basically what we do. And we don't have to feel comfortable with it, but that's actually what happens in the world. But what happens when you've got more people on the recipient end of that protection money and less people on the sort of funding end of it, is that your democracies no longer become democracies. They become rather a protection racket, which is basically what we're starting to see.
So like what Joel Kotkin calls hyper-feudalism.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like basically you've got more people that are dependent on the state than people are commanders of the state. The state's supposed to serve us, not the other way around. But when more people are dependent on it, whether it's through a UBI or through a grant or whatever you want to call it, that whole balance gets out of whack. So it's no longer a democracy then, it is more of a sort of a feudal state. So that's been happening, and that's a long-term trend. We've seen this with what's happening with the aging populations of Europe and America and Asia. We've got more and more people that are dependents for social security payments or for pension payments from the state, and less young people that are funding it. So it's not even a thing of a difference between rich and poor. I think that distinction should also be made, that the real distinction is between people that are dependent, people that are independent, people that are codependent, that have to trade for their income. So I don't see it as being two classes, the wealthy and the poor. I think there's really three strata when it comes to these social contracts. People that are entirely independent, that live off assets. That could be retired people or can be wealthy people. Then you've got your codependent, which is most of us that have to trade our time, goods or services in order to survive, but we still have to rely at least some on our own labor or output. We don't rely fully on the state, even if we might be supplemented through some sort of grants. And then the third strata being people who are entirely dependent on the mercy of the state. And that's the dangerous group, because that's a codependent relationship between power and between sort of sheer mass of humanity. And
that's it's most exaggerated in South Africa, obviously, because you can see that you have an extremely large, what I can't remember who's responsible for this, but it's a fantastic term. They call them the client class, which is the poor that are solely dependent on state grants. And then there's sort of a large parasitic bureaucracy that doesn't achieve anything, but draws large salaries. And this weird sort of parasitic what's the really dry academic term for it? Neo-patrimonialism.
Well, I don't even know that, so you're much smarter than me.
Oh no, I just did a very boring degree, that's all. But this picture in South Africa, and I've sort of gotten attention in my little corner of the world for very pessimistically suggesting that the West is headed in the direction of South Africa, with
Yeah, I said the same thing. That's my thesis. South Africa is a preview of the Weird West, not a look in the review mirror. I absolutely, totally agree with that.
Sorry, I just
In
very
so many
excitedly
different
have to
ways.
jump in here. Have you read Nick Land? You know Nick Land, right? The crazy. So did you know Fang Newman? The opening essay in it on what's it? It's on Kant and incest or something, like a weird title like that. And he the opening salvo in the first page or two is him basically saying that, this is saying in 1989, he was saying the apartheid South Africa with its Bantustans and what have you is basically a microcosm of the global economy. Totally. And he says, yeah, he does. And then he says this.
You don't have to like it. We don't have to approve of it, but it is.
No, forget the moral judgment for a second. What he's saying is that the transformation,
positive, not normative. Yes.
No, he's saying that the transformation of what he suggested, but it was rather presciently, in my opinion, is that the international boundaries in the West would come to be seen as the same as the Bantustan system, which they have in the current in the last electoral cycle, because you now see it as seen as absolutely it's like an absolute consensus now that depriving people of the right to immigrate to the West, it's considered you can't do that. You know, you get this narratives about kids in cages, about the racism and xenophobia in Europe, and so on and so forth. And there's an angle on this where you can sort of see the immigration policies of the West as trying to integrate something like a superstate across the entire Atlantic economic zone.
I don't know if that's actually what they're doing. That's what they're
no,
absolutely not. No, I think the EU is developed as basically as a wall to keep Africans out of Europe. I mean, that's my position on that. That might be a bit controversial, but the European Union is a country club, and it's designed to pretend to be integrated, but really, I reckon, to keep a lot of Africa out. I think that's done much more to prevent global migration than anything else.
I wouldn't say that, because well, look, this was part of my degree, so I did a bit on this. Is Europe is largely divided on this, and so you have people who profit from the border agencies that they're trying to integrate. Then you have a section who are trying to have a conservative, but the people who wield the most clout are those who are actually pushing for the open borders. And so you'll get these periodic decisions to relax controls on immigration and control it, and these move backwards and forwards. But ultimately, there is very little control on immigration into Europe, and deportations are very minimal. So the general trend, and you can sort of see this in the United States. Joe Biden, for example, is very enthusiastic for unlimited mass immigration, and has said so in the most certain of terms in public speeches, that he intends to make sure that, and I know that this is a very contentious thing to say for obvious reasons, but there was a speech he gave a couple of years ago where he said, we hope to make white people a minority in America by a certain point. And now, from a Democratic Party standpoint,
well, it's inevitable anyway. I mean, like, I think the trends say within like the next 10 to 20 years, white people will be a minority, or at least young people in schools will be. I mean, that's not even like you don't have to take a moral position on it. That's just a fact. I mean, like, and this is the other thing with Europe, is if they don't have immigration, they literally die out. I mean, this is what happens. The numbers just are not particularly in Europe's favor, or particularly, the certain corners of Europe. But I do still think that the European Union is designed to keep certain people out and certain people in, and it's phony open borders. It's not real, because what you're doing is you're trying to disperse migration across that entire portion, rather than actually taking them into your own nations. So I actually see it as being a phony open globalist project. I think it's actually, and that's my own view. And that's why I don't think that, I think that sort of like Brexit, of course, is fantastic for Africa, because now you've got two trading partners and not one. And if you remember sort of migration and the ability to travel to the UK and to Europe prior to their union, it was a lot easier for us to go work, move, travel. So I mean, like selfishly, I think Africa should be pro-Brexit because it's definitely within our interests to have, you know, more choice than not. And this is generally the thing with the world, more choice generally allows for more people to find a better solution. I know that's probably a very simplistic way to look at it, but that would be my general thesis. We want more choice and not less.
Do you worry about brain drain in that regard? Because I mean, this affects a lot of, particularly Eastern European countries, neighboring Europe. You get a very, very big problem with brain drain.
Of course, but then again, I don't have any national loyalties. I'm a free-born human being. I don't particularly, you know, care about one country's, you know, outlook compared to another. Also, not a particularly popular point of view, but I don't have any national loyalty to anyone.
No, of course not. But
and I don't think we should, just like I don't have any loyalty to any employer, right? So, you know, you've got to look after yourself, and what's best for us is more choice, what's best for the individual and what's best for humanity at large. So I do think that migration at large is good for the human project, and I think that far future ahead, that's the bigger challenges are human challenges, not international challenges, which brings me back to my sort of point that I was making earlier, sort of setting the scene that the point is the social contract is under stress across vast parts of the world. Again, South Africa is a preview there because we're further along that curve than other democracies, but democracies do tend towards having an outsized balance of dependence compared to contributors to that general sort of contract. And that doesn't make for very stable relations. It creates haves and have-nots. It creates enemy lines. And we've seen this. You see this in America, you see this in South Africa, you know, the taxpayers versus everyone else, whereas it should be a contract, everyone working together, everyone contributing and receiving something. But when you reach that tipping point, there's really no coming back. And the idea is, if you want to preserve democracy, is to postpone that tipping point for as long as possible. But democracy is not guaranteed. Neither are nation states. These are new concepts that we have. But can you have a nation state if you don't have a functional social contract? And the big spanner in the work right now is that you've got two parallel forces. The one is increasing pressure to accelerate the move towards having more dependence. And this is the movement that's pushing for things like universal basic income, increased entitlements. And it's sort of being driven by an ideology that governments can sort of spend money into existence. This is the whole modern monetary theory that's coming on board.
Where I am at the moment, Rutger Bregman, very, very popular, invited to the World Economic Forum to shell for a unusual combination of open borders and universal basic income. Which is
bizarre, which is impossible. Universal basic income and any welfare entitlements is premised on a border because it's premised on a social contract. Someone funds it, someone doesn't. Modern monetary theory is a bit in conflict with universal basic income ideas, in that those theorists, their complete thesis does say that people should be given jobs guarantees rather than free money, which is already a conflict point with a universal basic income ideology. But they could find a middle ground in that, you know, we print it and you get it, you know, like, you know, we give with one hand, take with another, which is sort of the way that most of the West is moving towards a compromise between basic income, so let's not call it universal, and maybe not the modern part, but just the monetary theory part where we can just print whatever we need to get it. Either way, that degrades your currency, obviously, and it creates a lot of bad money, which works as long as everyone believes in it. And quite frankly, if you're the dollar, no one has much of a choice in that.
But that's not strictly true. I mean,
wait.
Chronic inflation has had a massive impact on the last 50 years of
course it has. The inflation, like the future, is here. It's just not equally distributed. This is
the Cantillon
problem
effect,
with inflation.
The first receiver of money gets
the lion's share. But of course, the first receiver is always the person who the populist is trying to please. So you can see why this dynamic, while it does impoverish certain strata, particularly your codependent class that I was trying to talk about earlier, it does actually literally enrich your dependent class, and it also benefits your independent class. Your very wealthy also benefit from this, which is why you'll find your mega rich, your uber rich, your 0.1% tend to be in favor of policies like universal basic income, because they do understand that most of that money in that sort of a skewed, planned world finds its way into the same sorts of hands, which is the way the world works. We've seen this over the last year. What's happened? We've given out more money than ever before, and what's happened? The rich have got richer and the poor got poorer. We know this. South Africa's been running, again, a preview of the future, essentially the world's largest universal basic income trial program. If you look at the other trials, they've got nothing on our grants programs. And what's happened? Inequality has, if anything, increased.
It liquidates the economy, and it forces people to stick their money into other sources than...
it also forces the recipients to spend their money. And when it's spent, it ends up going to the same sort of places. So a universal basic income or a helicopter money drop, it does very different things for someone that is trying to survive compared to someone who's already middle class. Someone who's middle class goes and screws around with it on Robinhood, pumping meme stocks. They're a different group of people altogether. But
and then the wealthier still put it into land.
Yeah, wealthier still put it into land, and that compounds. So what happens with any sort of grant is that it increases the same cycles. Poor people run faster on the treadmill, like the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland. They run faster and faster. They're getting the money, but it's going just as fast. But it's a pseudo way to deal with inequality, but what it really does is actually increase it. Anyway, so you've got that sort of thing on the one side, which is actually leading us towards that social contract crisis anyway. So you've got the aging population, the increasing entitlements, more pressures on an ever dwindling tax base due to marginal fray as they keep on falling into the dependent class, trying to catch up with the increasing sort of tax burdens or obligations that come along with the increasing entitlements for other strata of society. But at the same time, we've got a wild card, which is this whole concept of borderless private money and your cryptocurrencies and decentralized finance. And that basically kills the social contract, because if good money is able to survive without coming into contact with bad money, what happens? What happens to your social contract?
It's like dollarization in Zimbabwe.
It's worse than that, because your crypto class is going to become essentially, as I see it, your new feudal knights, your new like Knights Templar, your new people that have a castle to live in. I mean, if you read the Sovereign Individual, the Bitcoin Old Testament, it sounds quite great. It reads like a propaganda puff piece to sell people onto crypto. But what it's really saying is that at the end of the day, you're going to have very few people that own all the newly minted private money, and everyone else gets to work for them, because this is what the crypto class, your decentralized finance bros, your crypto hodlers, and all the rest of them haven't thought through yet. They haven't realized that although they can keep their private money safe from the big bad tax man, as the rest of the world blows up around them, as per the mandibles, which is basically the crypto New Testament, if you want to read that too. The problem is, at some point, in order to defend their physical selves and their new assets that they've been able to accumulate with their new fantastic, good, decentralized, strong money, they're going to have to start investing in actually physical defense, because if the social contract breaks down, who protects you and your property? You're going to have to do that yourself. So in other words, your crypto overlords are going to have to start investing in real militarization, essentially, to build their own micronations or islands, literally, among what's going on with this breakdown of the social contract everywhere else. And the social contract won't break particularly fast, but first things go sort of, you go bankrupt first, slowly, then fast. And the slow part's happening now. It feels like it's fast, but it's still pretty slow. The dollar's still got a lot of run in it yet. So does China, all the rest of it. The system is so interlinked, and we have so much faith in these systems. They can keep running like a bureaucracy with its head cut off for quite a long time before it falls over. But what happens as it's falling over is that states start to increase controls everywhere, which only accelerates the movement from bad money to good. It only accelerates the building of your new virtual, basically feudal systems that are taking place. So the way that I see it, and the way a lot of my more esteemed futurist friends do see it, is that we're heading to a new dark age, which is going to be different to the last dark age. But what it does have in common is anarchy, and it also has in common new gods in the form of your sort of artificial intelligence on the one hand, and also your sort of true belief in virtues once again. So you've got like the rise of the virtuocracy instead of your sort of the Catholic Church that held the masses together, the ones that aren't able to come into the walls of the new crypto kingdoms, where essentially our new knight-based classes are going to come from. So if you're an anarchist, and if you are able to look after yourself, this would sound like a bit of a utopia to you. I mean, it's total anarchy right out there. You know, survival of the fittest, the strongest wins, the richest wins. Elon Musk's absolute wet dream, to put it that way. But for the rest of us, for people that have become accustomed to a social contract where things like safety and social security safety nets and law and order are things that we actually kind of like, you know, this might not be everyone's idea of a utopia. And I'm not sure the people that are pushing these agendas have fully thought through what it means for everyone else. Or maybe they have, and like you were talking about at the beginning, markets are amoral. Everyone takes what they can out of them. So that's my very cheerful sort of general thesis. It's full of lots of holes, but you're welcome to start unpicking them.
Oh no, I think the big thing that the only thing that's being left out is that hard currency introduces an element of justice into the system that you know, this sort of slow motion Mugabe, global Mugabenomics that we've been living under for a generation or so doesn't. Because if the state is printing money all the time and guaranteeing the success of state proximate firms, what you end up having is a damper on the pressure to produce efficient results. And as every old man will tell you, they don't make them like they used to in pretty much every category of product. And I've noticed that since 1971, you've got the gross fixed capital formation has been declining on a global level. So it creates a system in which robber barons doing aggressive sort of hostile takeovers and liquidations of companies, the whole economic situation suits them and the crony capitalists, but not the honest businessman.
It suits people that understand the loopholes, and the people that understand the loopholes are those with the most expensive lawyers. Yes.
What's that phrase from it was from Game of Thrones? The bugger said, "Chaos is a ladder." But the interesting
thing, it's not even that. Like chaos is actually a leveler because everyone sort of plays with the same randomness. I think rules, incidentally, are what create the false efficiencies in marketplaces. Like if you look at monopolies, there's no monopoly without a regulation. There's literally no monopoly without regulation, which feels wrong. It feels counterintuitive. But it comes down to that whole concept.
You're making me think of a concept in entropy that they use for that's being used to describe sort of early biogenesis. So there's a general concept that someone figured out that when you have a temperature gradient, in order to maximally sort of most efficiently transfer energy from a high to low, high to low temperature zone, you actually get highly complex sort of fluid dynamics. And the more complex they are, so the higher the temperature gradient, the more complex the fluid formations are. And so the complexity, they say, it increases the efficiency of the energy transfer. And so when you get these sort of zones of extremely low entropy, it's an efficient dissipation of energy. And so what really is, so the argument over there would be that this incredibly complex society with these extreme structures, by engaging in all of this nonsense, they're maximally depleting resources.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, like, but even just look at sort of regulation, what's going on with sort of social networks at the moment. All regulation does is make the biggest social networks even bigger because no small competitor is able to jump through all of those hoops. This is what regulation does in a nutshell. It protects, it creates a moat. It doesn't damper the biggest guy in the room. It actually supports him. And like as Dan Faggella says, who I love very much, it's one of my favorite thinkers out there. He does a lot of work with AI. He says there's two ways to power. It's either through innovation or through regulation, right?
Yes.
So yeah, that really says everything that's going on in the world. The more complex, the more man-made complexity, not natural chaos, the more man-made complexity, the more inequality we get. The more inequality we get in terms of both power and wealth. What we need is more randomness. So I'm all for a bit of anarchy out there. I'm just not sure that most people are ready for the amount of anarchy that is coming their way. And that given the choice, understanding the two paths that we are able to face, I'm pretty sure most people would vote for more totalism, for more nanny statism, than they would be prepared to vote for more anarchy because of how hard it is to compete in this world that we are stumbling into with happy faces and you know,
Well, I mean, the past
Doggy calling memes.
the past 150 years demonstrates that unequivocally. People like free stuff, and
Obviously, most people would choose free stuff over freedom, and can you blame them? I mean, life is hard. But for
yeah, I
those
mean,
of
that's
us
why
who prefer the other end of the equation, it's infuriating.
it's like
But you
libertarians are
can't
always like
judge them.
10%. They're always only like 10% of the population.
I know, very
They never get.
unpopular. We're never, and we don't get along either. We don't organize. Libertarians don't organize. They'll never. There's a libertarian party is an oxymoron. I mean, this is what I don't get about Americans. You can't have one of those.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, it's funny you mention how regulation sort of favors the wealthy, because I mean, I've recently been on a bit of a bender of these sort of very, very cynical fellows, one of whom is Anthony Sutton, who's so you know who he is. You know about his little theory of Wall Street backing Hitler and Stalin to sorry, not Hitler and Stalin, Hitler and Lenin, in order to have captive economies that they can fleece.
Yeah, they're capitalists at the core of everything, right? This is the thing. There's no clean business. That's
I mean, it's a fantastic irony is that Marxism is in service of big capital. It's one of my favorite sort of little twists.
Yeah, but capital is also at war with capital. This is the great thing about capitalism. It's not that it's a perfect system, but rather that, because everyone is selfish, they all destroy each other at the end of the day. At the end of the day, there's always someone that's going to meme stock you, or there's someone that's going to do exactly what you did to them. And this is why I love reading Michael Lewis's books, because the more of a slice of the pie people take, the harder it bites them in the end, if they're allowed to fail. And this is the beauty of like a proper free market system, is that the big ones do fall over. Scale does limits, and it does implode upon itself, and evil gets bitten by the next wave of evil. And there is Darwinian moments in it. The problem that we have right now is that we have this weird form of not quite free capitalism, where what ineffectively is happening is that we've got free markets for the poor and for the outsiders. So we've got very controlled markets for the rich. So we've got this sort of financial socialism, or socialism for the rich, which is the worst of both worlds. So you've got bailouts for banks, but not for individuals.
Yes.
This is why people hate what is termed capitalism, but they don't understand it's not capitalism. They've got only the risk side of the equation. They don't have the reward side of the equation. We've managed to completely separate those two. Of course, people are upset. Of course, people would rather take socialism where everyone gets nothing. I mean, there's amazing Russian proverbs of that, where it's like, I'd rather shoot my own cow than let you have half of it. There's great things there. Envy is a core driver of society. Envy and greed are really the same thing. It's just greed is, of course, envy satiated, whereas envy is unrealized envy as of yet. And these are core driving motives in society. But of course, people are angry. Of course, people hate the wealthy because they know the game is completely rigged. You can't have that. And this is the crypto problem, because I'm very resentful of the captains of techno industry, the Clubhouse crowd, the ones that somehow manage to spend 6 hours of their day, these so-called wealthy startup leaders from Silicon Valley, manage to spend 6 hours of their day chatting to strangers on Clubhouse on the internet. But anyway, besides the point, the amount of them support helicopter money, universal basic income, increased quantitative easing, and cryptocurrency are the biggest hypocrites in the world, because they're essentially saying, I'm libertarian with my money and I'm socialist with yours. I'm so generous with your money, but you're never going to touch mine. And they've also got a perverse incentive to cheer on the destruction and the increasing acceleration of that destruction of the social contract outside the walls of their crypto fortified gardens. So I'm hugely skeptical of characters like that. Of course, I understand it's amorality and vampires all the way down, but these are the same people that are preaching altruism with everyone else's money. And there's a lot of those characters online that I feel like should be called out.
Yeah, I mean, but like they've always been like this. I mean, Armand Hammer was a member of the Communist Party, so the inventor of socialism. No wonder we hate them all. Owens, the inventor of socialism, was a major capitalist who turned his business into a traditional company town where everyone belonged to the company. So socialism is. I mean, what was Lenin's description of socialism? He said it's a factory floor that spans the entire globe and from which no soul can escape. I mean, how lovely.
Beautiful.
Yeah. But I mean,
well, I do like to say, as an aside, that I do respect pure communists a whole lot more than I respect socialists. I mean, at least if you're going to back an ideology, you must be prepared to walk it all the way down the line. So that is my position. Once again, it's about ethics, about pinking aside, being consistent.
Well, speaking of pie in the sky future dreams, there's a slightly more realistic one that happens to be a work of fiction, and I don't know if you've come across the Terra Ignota series by Ada Palmer.
No, that's
if this doesn't blow your mind, so the basic idea is she sees the world in like a couple of 100 years where all nation states, obviously, much to your delight, have completely been erased. And the world is dominated
anyway, but
yeah, the world has been
delighted about it.
Yeah, the world is dominated by these really, really large city states, and she seems to have foreseen Elon Musk's rocket technology succeeding because everywhere in the world is reached within 2 hours by sort of orbital rocket flight. And so it becomes a sort of public choice, a global public choice system where everyone moves to zones whose laws and morality they favor. But the vast majority of the society is dominated by what are called hives, which are these global free associations like Freemasons and, for some reason, the Mitsubishi Company. And each of
have a company town, yeah.
yeah. And so you have like these 6 or 7 of them that sort of span the globe, and everyone sort of becomes a member of one of them when they come of age, and then there's like some global laws that fit in between and so on. And I mean, I don't know how that'll turn out. I mean, do you think that the mere fact of easy sort of travel across the globe like that will accelerate the dissolution of the nation state like that? Or do you
I don't think travel's got much to do with it. I think it's got everything to do with the good old monopoly on power at the end of the day, or monopoly on force. And this is what sort of most contemporary theorists seem to gloss over, whereas past thinkers thought about that a lot. They thought about who actually owns the biggest guns in the room, who actually has physical control over people, and we've kind of forgotten about that because we've lived in essentially a rather violence-free world. I know South Africa is an exception there, but we've lived in a very peaceful bubble as our global generation, so we haven't really thought about that too much, but that's what it comes down to. And I think that there's very serious moves going on in the world at the moment. And I think the last year, if that hasn't proven to you that those who have the force, have the ability to make you do things that whether you believe in them or not, whether you believe they're right or not, that the people who have a monopoly on force have the ability to get you to do things or to prevent you from doing things, I think it should be a huge wake-up call to us. Yeah, but it doesn't matter. Owning the financial layer is a proxy to power. Power is the ultimate end. And money is a poor proxy to power. And there is an overlap, but there are things that cash can't buy you, that deeper systems have more control over. And of course, and this is very easy to prove, because of course, if I'm able to point a gun at your head, I can take all your money, whereas I can wave all my money at you and I can't get you to give you my gun or to give me your gun. There's very there's various ways to look at that, and I think that people that have lived in totalitarian regimes understand this quite well. That money only gets you so far. And I've been reading up on the Rwandan genocides also. I mean, like that really does speak that there are deeper things that move us than pure cash, and that's the layer that hasn't fully been thought through by our tech titans, our new industrial titans of imaginary empires, which is what they've got. They've got imaginary empires. Titans of the past controlled land and assets. Our titans today control financial assets.
I suppose that explains why Soros and Gates and all of those big buggers are...
They're realizing that now. They're all cashing out and buying up real stuff, right? But it's taken them a bit of a while to figure this one out. Maybe they've been planning it all along, but I'm not that much of a conspiracy theorist.
But your point about about where power lies. I mean, again, there's another cheesy quote from George Martin where he sort of talks about, like, a mercenary and a priest and a king, and they all stand around trying to get this. No, the priest, a king, and a banker trying to get this mercenary to kill the other two. And he says, well, which one wins? And he says, well, who knows? I mean, it's all an illusion. Power falls to whoever can convince. And it makes you think. I mean, there's a fellow. There's a friend of mine who's a huge fan of Paul Linebarger, who is one of the architects of America's psychological warfare program. And I mean, the amount of energy the United States has put in the early to mid 20th century into crafting mechanisms of psychological control at a global scale, absolutely mind-boggling.
Yeah, starting from Edward Bernays and going all the way up. I mean, the Russians took over for a bit, and the British are doing amazing things over there right now. My word.
Yeah, no, they've got...
The British were so devious. But the Americans have slacked off on that. That's actually quite interesting from a security analyst point of view. America's information warfare, and they sort of like meme warfare, whatever you want to call it, they've underinvested in that really since the Cold Wars ended. Their psychological warfare and their internal and external propaganda campaigns have fallen behind on a global level. Russia's carried on doing what they've always done.
I wouldn't say that. I mean,
it's not been as much of a strategic priority for them. They have not. I think it's changing now. I mean, like, as we've all heard, Biden wants to appoint, what's it now? What is he calling it? A reality czar.
Reality czar, a ministry of truth. Yes, exactly like
a literal ministry of truth. But that's a new thing. It hasn't. There've been other things that they've been doing and other forms of control, but not controlling the narrative, rather controlling via force, which is interesting. But I mean, it's all part of the same system. But where governments deploy different forms of force are interesting. But I've read up on that, and it's in terms of the information defenses, America's not been particularly good at that, and protecting their own populations from external influence.
Yeah,
the reason from influencing other populations.
The reason I would disagree with you on that is that there is largely because of the CIA's. It's not only the CIA; it's a coalition of a whole bunch of different what they call alphabet soup. But
they whole lot. Yes, they've got a bunch.
The program is called the Enduring Security Framework. And it's a public-private partnership that includes all major social media tech companies, and they used them rather aggressively to manage the Arab Spring uprising. And so, I mean, this was this is pretty large-scale stuff, and the interesting thing is when you look at how very detailed and integrated their intelligence programs are and how willing they are to use. There was an article that it absolutely blows my mind. It's only from a week or two ago from there's a fella, something Alexander, in the New York Times, who described how the article's title is "How the Democrats Prepared for Doomsday," and in this article, he describes how in a single Zoom call, they managed to shut down the entire national infrastructure of Antifa and BLM and all activists. Just 900 people, one Zoom call, one quick set of instructions. You all go home now. They didn't show up to challenge Trump supporters on the 6th. So I mean, it's mind-blowing, because you no longer need sort of direct control of the media. You have total control of the civil service, of the largest political party. You have all of the civil society belongs to you. You control you control social media, and all of the traditional media are part of a cartel that consists of 6 owners who are in direct contact with the senior leadership of the United States. And so, I mean, I don't think that I think that the idea that they need to run old-fashioned sort of targeted propaganda programs hardly, it's almost like that would be an obsolete way of doing business.
I don't know if that's obsolete. I think it is still very powerful. I mean, like the case studies across how they've managed to swing elections, like by external companies and by marketers, not even by like government shadow agencies, but how marketers are able to swing elections and change things just by knowing how to play people. I've done my hours in the marketing trenches. I totally believe it. It's quite easy to get people to do things that they wouldn't believe it they would want to do. Ryan Holiday's work there is also quite amazing, showing how you can persuade people, mainly for commercial gain, but the same tools can be applied. And they are very, very powerful. I think things are changing. I think the information warfare age has been stepped up a lot over the last year, but I don't think it's been core for probably, the last sort of 10, 20 years. I don't think that's been where the focus has been. The crises haven't really been there. What we've seen is basically a Western spring that has taken place. I'm sure you have come across Adam Townsend, also Twitter
Townsend
character.
or Townsend?
Oh, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right. Jim O'Shaughnessy's friend. But anyway, his whole thing was like, he's been writing quite a lot about how just before COVID took place, there was waves of protests sweeping across the Weird West, everything from the yellow vests through to the pink pussy hat parades, through to the Black Lives Matter movements, through to what was going down in Italy and Germany and even Nordic Europe. And that's all kind of been put on pause over the last year. So we've had a spring. Before that, things were quite stable for a long time. But those color protests.
That's not true.
It has. No, it's gone on pause. It's been sort of dampened, suppressed, covered. But it's all the anger is still there. We still have to deal with it. Yeah, the coverage and also the physical protests have been stamped out to a large degree due to lockdowns. Like physically, there have been physical restrictions on the ability to mass mobilize. So it's been convenient from that point of view. But I mean, I was tracking, like this, we do a state we're in briefing every year just on what's going on in the world.
Yes.
And 2019, all of our state year in presentations were just pictures of these color protests. It actually makes an incredible slide to put up. Because and they were all color based. So you had like the Extinction Rebellion people, and you had the pink pussy hat people, and you had the Black Lives Matter people, and the yellow vests, all these very color coordinated protests all going on in the Western world all at the same time. Mass movements. And that's kind of been sort of suppressed for a minute, but it's going to come back. I mean, this is the social contract that we saw fracturing.
Well,
that's why we're seeing the revival of things like information warfare or meme warfare directed at our own populations. We're trying to accommodate some sort of reassess some sort of measure of control. And the question is, of course, how long we're able to sort of put this temporary pause on in the form of lockdowns and things, and how long, but that's not going to hold forever. I mean, this is bubbling up everywhere.
Yeah, I mean,
at some point we have to deal with it. Just like South Africa again, you have to deal with your past. If you don't actually deal with it, it just festers and grows. You have to have that reckoning. And it can't be done quietly behind closed doors. Their societies require scapegoats. They require closure. They require punishment and trial and retribution. This is the law and order system, even our legal system. It's about a sense of justice more than it is about punishing actual perpetrators. Like, actually, yeah, if you think about it,
that's an extraordinarily nihilistic view. So who do you decide? So on what basis do you decide this scapegoat then?
Yeah, well, I don't think that even matters to society so much. That as long as there is an actual reckoning, there has to be punishment. Punishment is always more important to social healing than actual justice is. And this is the problem with like South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There was a lot of truth, but there was no reckoning. And this is my sort of general thesis as to why South Africa can't move forward. And we had this sort of painted over rainbow, but it didn't mean anything to anyone because none of the guilty were ever punished. And because none of the guilty were ever punished, that means the current batch of guilty leaders essentially have a free pass.
Well, that was the whole point.
How can you? Yeah, no, but how can you hold any leadership to account if past leadership was let off? So you sort of stuck in limbo land until you actually deal with the problems of your past.
Indeed.
And this is what the whole Western world is having to deal with. No one's atoned for any sins. There has been no reconciliation. There's only been truth and social justice, which is not the same thing at all.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting that you make that analogy again, because it's become a thing now where practices that every single civilization, every society has engaged in since the dawn of time are now ones that the Western world is solely and exclusively guilty for and have to pay for eternity. And I think that's a very, very interesting concept, because while apartheid had its own sort of, the termination of apartheid had its own peculiar sort of thing, the way in which the United States has taken this on with the 1619 project, absolutely extraordinary how draconian it's become. Really, really peculiar. And
Well,
I
that's the
wonder
thing.
how long that can
Until
hold on.
guilty parties are punished, then everyone is guilty. You know,
Yes, but
and this is why society requires the scapegoating element. And it's not even necessarily an innocent scapegoat. Ideally, it should be a guilty scapegoat, but there has to be a punishment and an acknowledgement of guilt by someone or something. If there's going to be any sort of social healing. But we're talking about social crimes now, not individual crimes. The individual victims, the first victims, you know, the ones that were actually physically there, that were suffering at that time, are mostly no longer with us. But the societal sort of victimhood pervades, and it's impossible to fix without a reckoning. Germany actually learned this. Germany learned this after the whole reunification, when they paid their reparations, taxes, and all the rest of it. They put their blood sacrifice out, and it was a financial sacrifice, which is, you know, worse than blood these days for us amoral capitalistic creatures. But they were able to have that sacrifice, essentially, that tangible punishment was meted out. And even though the people that were paying it were innocent of the crimes on the table, they understood that you had to have a guilty party and you had to have a sacrifice, whether it's a financial one or a blood sacrifice, which is what we actually get if we don't deal with this. You end up with actual violence. You know, it only permeates more. But anyway, that's very philosophical, and I've definitely probably been reading too much of that sort of philosophy. But
you're scratching at something very dangerous, I think.
Very dangerous.
Because there are two people who've taken that to its logical. Well, off the top of my head, there are two very obvious examples of that logic being taken to its conclusion. Now, we've been discussing the resentment towards a class that profiteers from hyperinflation. And in Germany, they found a scapegoat for that in the Jews. And in Rwanda, they had an ethnic minority who were an instrument of colonial domination, who became the scapegoat for political instability and economic degradation. And I think one of the things that pretty much everyone in South Africa who's of even a mildly conservative bent, or even just right of Robert Mugabe, sort of considers vaguely at the back of their mind is, at what point will it become generally acceptable, beyond simply the ruling political class, to call for genocide in South Africa? Because we know that not only is it acceptable for members of the EFF, but that they have an extremely close and personal bond with large parts of the ANC's leadership. And I'm aware that the physical dimensions of South Africa's military situation would make it largely impossible for such a thing to happen.
I think it's a different dynamic playing out in South Africa, and I think you have to look at the rest of Africa for some indications there. I think that Zimbabwe was actually the exception to that rule, rather than a sort of harbinger of what's going to happen elsewhere. And there's many reasons for that, and there's many examples to look at it there. But we already know where the violence comes in South Africa. We know who the scapegoats are, and unfortunately, as with most of these cases, I mean, whether you're looking at Germany or whether you're looking at Rwanda, it was neighbors that were the victims.
Yes.
It wasn't the foreigners.
That's
it was
true. Yes.
And this is the natural human dynamic of envy. Envy goes after those that are closest to you, that seem to have a bit more. So you've got to understand that the middle class in South Africa is very cosmopolitan, and that regardless of your skin color or ethnic background, if you're living in a townhouse, in essentially a citadel, you have the same sort of worldview. You might vote for a different party, but essentially your kids go to the same school. You have the same sort of outlook there. And you also have the same investment. This is not where the wells of resentment bubble up in South Africa. It is in the disenfranchised majority, and the resentment is directed towards foreign Africans, which is horrible, but it's true. And there's plenty of evidence to point to this. This is what we should be concerned about. This is the horror that could come out of South Africa.
Well,
that's the same horror that's been a threat since the 1980s, with the various different factional infighting leading up to the end of apartheid. And that's the real physical violence worry that we should be concerned about. Crime is a different story. And there's various different psychological reasons there where I'd say that's probably the biggest security threat.
It's very interesting that
genocide of like a Madagascan genocide of kicking the colonists out. We passed that now. I mean, like even the poorest people know that the middle class is made up more of not white people anymore than white people. You know, not the wealthiest strata, but the mass affluent has changed shape dramatically. And that's not where anger is being directed at the moment.
It's interesting that you point to that one, because the moves that Cyril Ramaphosa has recently been making with regard to the African Union, they're moving towards declaring a serious open border policy. I mean, not that our border hasn't been fairly porous to begin with, but there's a difference between sort of porous enforcement.
They're trying to make an African Union like a European Union.
Yeah.
But South Africa has not been very participatory in that. And of course, we are the primary destination.
Yes.
It's a very similar sort of Britain type parallel going on over there.
I mean, this is why it's so interesting that Cyril Ramaphosa declared earlier this year that they would, by the end of this year, have open borders. They will have an African passport. And I immediately think of, considering the fact that we have the Put South Africa First movement, which much like the National Democratic Revolution parties, you're seeing people tool up and pick up weapons and go into military training camps, quite a lot of them. So there's a lot of that going on. And I immediately thought about the Ivorian Civil War, because you know what happened there, because they opened their border to the neighboring Muslim countries, and they, within a generation, they became majority Muslim. And then the two sectors of the population went to war with each other. And the country is still largely divided right down the middle geographically as a result of this. I strongly suspect this maneuver by Cyril Ramaphosa could be highly dangerous. What do you make of it?
Well, I think xenophobia is one of the biggest security threats in South Africa at the moment, and there's not a lot of brotherly love across SADC at the moment, which is something we have to be aware of. This is not anything to be proud of. It's one of the great shames of South Africa. We're supposed to be a bit of a different example to the rest of the continent, but we have positioned ourselves as being relatively isolationist compared to the rest of Africa. It's a huge worry, and there are huge reasons why people want to be here. There's also huge reasons why many South African-born Africans don't necessarily want other people to come in, because there's such scarcity. And I mean, like, a lot of this could be fixed if we had a growing economy. We could take in as many immigrants as we liked. I mean, like, I'm generally pro open borders and all the rest of it, but from a security point of view, it's definitely something of concern. I don't think we have a very particularly strong military, as you mentioned earlier, that can like stop these sorts of things from breaking out. I don't know how organized that sort of violence threat would be. I'm sure there's better, smarter people that spend more time looking at those sorts of risks, but the xenophobia question is one that you can't really separate from the open borders question. I don't think the open borders are happening quite as soon as you say. I think they're starting with diplomatic passports right now, which is very, very different tier of society. And we have always been welcoming to Africa's high net worth individuals, you know, like, or what, to 10,000 of them.
Or Europe's high net worth individuals.
Which is an entirely different story. It's the mass opening of borders that's going to be a question. But as much as they're paying lip service to that right now, South Africa's actual decisions on the ground have been to tighten those borders. So I'm sure if you know any Zimbabweans that have tried to work here, it's been harder to renew passports. They've been more efficient with deportations. They've been more aggressive with family separations. So we've got to look at what's really happening. I'm not sure how imminent the open border question really is. I think there's bigger concerns to worry about here, like the pushing through of things like national health insurance and the expropriation bill and that sort of thing is much more immediate threats to South Africa's general stability.
No, that's definitely true. I mean, but you made a very, very interesting comment. I can't remember if it was today or yesterday on Twitter, where you asked what would be the first country to be taken over by a private company.
Yeah, I mean, like we've got the biggest FANG stocks. They're worth like 24% of the US stock market. They're worth more than many nations. So it'd be quite easy to buy out a debt-ridden country that's overextended their modern monetary theory magic wand. And like, what you're going to do? You've got two choices. What you're going to let China loan you money, or would you like to, or can maybe Microsoft buy it, for example? Especially the smaller nations. And thinking here, this conversation comes from conversations with various different friends that work in both the security space and the futures space.
Oh, the security
particularly looking
space.
What's happening. Yeah, looking at what's happening with particularly in the northern hemisphere as climate change shifts patterns, and what's happening with that whole Arctic Circle and controlling key territories over there is going to become very, very interesting going forward. Those are generally low populated nations up there. I mean, you're sort of like past Greenland, looking at the little islands up there, becoming strategic naval bases for a whole lot of interesting things involving good old-fashioned oil, other minerals, and just general trade routes to opening up that northern hemisphere of the globe. The Arctic is shaping up to be interesting for the next 10 or 20 years, especially looking at what China and Russia and India are all doing in terms of military maneuvers around that space. Under cover of Corona, a lot of interesting things have been happening. Wow.
India,
yes.
in the Arctic.
Yeah, watch what's going to happen there. They're going to make a play for that space. India's got the population. It's got a particularly aggressive government at the moment. I mean, it goes all the way up to Nepal up there and all the rest of it. They're going to want their share of that space too. I think India's government's got aspirations. What they're building in their tech stack layers is quite impressive. That shows they've got their own ideas. They're a bit different, a bit more chaotic than China's ideas. But it's a different flavor of totalism. It's more of a sort of ideological totalism than a techno-totalism, but interesting to see what's happening there. I think India is a great case study. I don't think it's the next China, but it's the next India. They got their own ideas.
Oh, it's going to be very hairy, because I mean, anytime you catch two Indians arguing on Twitter, eventually Caste comes out and they start pulling out their 23andMe list. Well, I have this marker, and that's definitely shows that I'm from.
I'm sure you're stereotyping me right there. That's wrong.
No. It's just I've seen it enough times that I can't imagine it's going to go away.
I think it's more religious than anything else. I think it's the Islam question and like, the whole history of the stuns around there. That's where it gets very, very
that's their scapegoat that they get to unify behind, which unfortunately, I mean, one of the shocking things that I come across when I bump into those fellas is that one of their big targets is the Taj Mahal, which they somehow see as this blight on their country that has to be destroyed because it reminds them of Mughal domination. Which, I mean, if you think it reminds me of when I was reading
parallels everywhere. I mean, the Americans are tearing down their history. No one wants to reckon with their past, right?
Well, it started with us. It started with us.
Architecture.
This wave of iconoclasm started with us.
We are a preview of the future with old Cecil. Yeah, not that anyone misses Cecil too much, but
but they like toppling the effigy of Cecil, but they can't bring themselves to destroy the accursed share that he left behind. They all want to get their hands on it, which I think is absolutely fascinating. They can't tear apart this nation of South Africa. They want to control it, and I always think that's a very interesting dimension of these retributive maneuvers, is that they tend to, instead of
it's much easier to change the paint than it is to actually build a new house, right? I mean, this is what it is. It's about redecorating, not about rebuilding.
No, that's very true, and I think it's funny you say that, because the we hear a lot of build back better, but a lot of the changes seem to be cosmetic and seem to be sort of consolidating things that have already been the case for the past decade. Patterns of power, patterns of law, patterns of
It's not build back better, it's build back stronger.
whose slogan would that be?
Well, everyone is using build back better. It's build back stronger. Like reinforce that foundation, that moat.
Oh yeah.
Tie that red tape tighter. It's we should leave that alone before I get in trouble.
Before you get in trouble.
So many terrible things. Anyway.
Okay. Well, I've probably got you into enough trouble with sort of borderline taboo subjects for one night. So hope before you get dragged
Borderline
on.
taboo. No, I think you said more terrible things than I did. I don't endorse anything you said.
No. I've a very I'm a terrible black-hearted individual. So but I hope I haven't dragged your brand down too much by having you
I
on
don't
my
think that's
channel.
possible.
All right. Well, it's been very pleasant talking to you. Thank you for talking to me.
All good.
Yeah.